sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome, everyone, to Pod and Man at Yale. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Mickey Lynn, a senior.
Hi.
And Justin Greenman, a second-year PhD in American politics.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us, guys. So both of you participated in the Buckley Institute's trip to New York City with Richard Brookhiser to see Hamilton on Broadway. Was it your first time seeing the show? Had you seen it before?
It was my first time seeing it.
It was also my first time seeing it.
Oh, wow. So what did you guys think of the show?
It was awesome. Like my first musical in person.
Really?
Yes. Ever in my entire life.
That's amazing.
I've definitely seen musicals before, but I haven't been to Broadway too often. It was just, I think there's been so much hype about Hamilton right over the past decade, and it lived up to it, which was amazing.
Definitely.
Had you guys heard some of the songs, some of the music before?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think you can't study history and politics without people either assuming that you've seen Hamilton or assuming that you know the soundtrack, or they ask me questions. And so yeah, I feel like it's been a part of the lexicon for long enough, but now to actually see it, I think made it much more tangible.
Definitely heard some of the songs before. Did I know what I was singing about? Not really.
So having never heard like the songs before, could you like understand the lyrics well enough hearing the first time?
Well, I think like the first time I had to, these past few days after the trip, I've been listening to more of the soundtrack, and I think it's been making a little bit more sense. But the first time around, yes, it did make sense.
That's good.
Yeah, I think for me, just the lyrics, it goes a mile a minute, right?
Right.
Like, you really have to pay attention, and you'll pick up on little references, historical facts, in other information. So I'm sure I definitely missed a lot. I probably should listen to the soundtrack to see maybe some of the stuff that I missed. But yeah, that's just Lin-Manuel Miranda, right? Like he did such a good job at weaving in history, but obviously you want the songs to be catchy and interesting and fun to listen to.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm glad you guys enjoyed it so much. Like, I wasn't sure whether I was going to ask you for just your general reviews because it'd been around for so long, but I guess you guys hadn't seen it before. I was curious for first impression. But I'm also curious, I guess, the more historical side. So watching the show, what did it make you think about Alexander Hamilton and then about America's like founding fathers in general? Like, did it give you more perspective into their life, more insight, things you didn't know before, more respect, more curiosity?
For me, definitely, I think it portrayed how intricate or how interconnected the founding fathers' lives were. I think we've probably read a lot of their writings like separately from one another, like the Federalist Papers. But I think through the show, I was able to see like how like Washington's effect on Hamilton and how like they were all interconnected in some ways, and that gave a full picture to the kind of the vision that they were building America on.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think Hamilton is a figure that definitely before the musical came out, I feel like maybe was playing second fiddle to Washington, to Madison, to Jefferson, some of the other figures. I think Hamilton has led to a revival. The musical, I should say, has led to a revival in Hamilton the person. Sure. So I feel like I've been reading more about him, but like I've had undergraduate classes where it's like Hamilton and the founding, because Hamilton's the hook now. But I think to Mickey's point, right, seeing these founding fathers, warts and all, kind of working sometimes together, sometimes more antagonistically, I think it just makes a more rich portrayal of early American politics and early American history.
Yeah, and I'll say to that point, like before the play, like Alexander Hamilton was always thrown in the mix. But like, I knew about him in the National Bank. I remember learning like his history, but he was always, like you said, playing second fiddle. So it really did give me that perspective, like, oh wait, this guy like was really an important part of all this.
I mean, to that point, I think like when I was working on the Hill, and I had to give like Capitol tours, I was like, now looking back, yeah, we never really talked about Hamilton on the national tours.
I mean, did you guys know much about him before you saw the play, or like before, outside of context of references to the show?
I mean, so as somebody who does political science from more of a historical angle, I feel like I was relatively familiar with the time period, with some of his accomplishments. You brought up the bank. That's a kind of great example, or his, some of his other policies. And obviously, his relationship with Aaron Burr. But I think some of the other references, whether to his military career, obviously his personal life, his marriage and kind of how that evolved, I think I definitely was not as familiar with. And I think, again, to Lin-Manuel Miranda's credit, right, he covers Hamilton warts and all.
For me, in my early education, I think definitely not talked about much. I don't think I knew much about Hamilton coming into watching the show. I think the only thing I remember was that didn't he die by a duel? Right. I was that's the only thing I knew, pretty much.
And I remember, I think before I saw the show, I actually read the book, the Ron Chernow book that it's largely based on. And, I had never thought about the fact that Aaron Burr was the vice president at the time. And in the bio, they go into how awkward it is that the vice president has killed a man in New Jersey.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think it's one of the jobs that I held before I started my PhD was I was a history tour guide in New York. And one of the tours was a Lower Manhattan one. And so you go to Hamilton's grave and you talk about it. And it's if you think about it, right, it's the vice president of the United States, which then was a less important position, but it's still the vice president, killing arguably the leader of the political opposition, right, in a duel. And you just think, what, the political dynamics that were necessary to both get to that point, and what it also says, because I think there's this perception that, we've never been more divided, no, we have been extremely divided, right? You think of Hamilton and Burr, you think of Hamilton and Jefferson. I think it's a reminder that, right, history maybe what's the Mark Twain line, right? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. There are certain through lines in whether it's political division, polarization through today.
So, what stood out to most to you guys in learning more about Hamilton's life through the play?
Was it for me? It's just how young everybody was. I'm 25, right? So I think by the time Hamilton was 25, he was already George Washington's chief of staff. He was already this kind of central player in the American Revolution. That's, of course, not. I'm not saying that to put me down, right? If you watch the Olympics and it's this person's 14 years old. Okay, I already feel bad about myself. But I think even Washington was in his 40s, he was, I think, in his 50s when he was elected president. It was a country. America was such a young country, and obviously soon after its founding, and the people who ran it were so young. And and I think that's just something that. Maybe today where there's always this debate about politicians. Are they too old? You're a career politician, all those things. None of these people were career politicians. They were college students. They were, businessmen. They were lawyers, people who kind of came to politics late in life in a sense, but often were just very young.
Yeah, for me, I think also their passion or their desire for something new or for something, this vision that they were all trying to strive for, even though sometimes they clash and had different visions. That passion, I think, is sometimes inspiring. That I think it's a little bit unfound today. I mean, I think most of us climb the hill, climb the ladder, work a 6-figure job, but then what's the vision? I think that is missing today. That I think the founding fathers maybe had. And to also for the children's, I think the song Dear Theodosia or something.
Theodosia.
Oh, yeah, Theodosia. Yeah. I mean that song actually moves me a lot. Almost I was listening to it earlier today and I was low-key about to cry. Because I think it's just that at Yale we go through about our daily lives, kind of just thinking about our future, but kind of separately from everybody else. It's a Yale bubble in our own individual sense. And so I think hearing that song and them building this vision for their kids, I think was very touching.
So you mentioned the Yale campus. I want to bring it back to Yale, right? And the founding fathers. I think this is less of a thing, so to speak, than it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But the idea of the founding fathers and whether they should be taken seriously or whether they should be dismissed as, quote unquote, old white men. So I want to ask you what your guys' experience on campus is. How are the founding fathers talked about? How is Hamilton talked about? With respect, with dismissiveness? Do people just not care? What's your sense?
I mean, I think for me, it varies by the person and it varies kind of in what spaces you're in. I found that a lot of people are if not dismissive of the founding era ideals, they're just kind of uninformed, right? I think they don't know. Like maybe they've read the Constitution, maybe they had to read some of the Federalist Papers in a intro American history class or something like that. But I don't think that there's too many opportunities at Yale, and I would say probably most similar institutions, to really reflect on how both foundational and, I think to your point, Mickey, how radical and passionate this movement was. And of course, there's people who, have malice and, want to find all the faults. And I think there's people obviously the other way who, only, focus on the founders and, that's kind of what they do. I think just for most people, it's just not as, no pun intended, like foundational as the founders should probably be. And I think you may be seeing a push in that direction now. I mean, if you think of, some other universities that are mandating civics classes or things like that, but like I never had to take a civics class. I never had to take a founding era class. I did because, history, politics, they interest me. But I think a lot of people just don't, if they know anything about Hamilton, it's from the $10 bill and maybe just having seen the musical. It's not actually reading the Federalist Papers or his other works or looking at his financial plans and the benefits and drawbacks of them and, the legacies that we have of that today.
I guess my question, so for Mickey in particular, based on your sense of looking at the undergrad course offerings, like, are there a lot of classes on early American history? Are there seminars on like the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence?
I don't think there's a lot, but I think there was a few classes, like one maybe on Lincoln and maybe there was one on Jefferson maybe. I wanted to take the Lincoln one, but it just didn't line up. But I think I would hope to take one hopefully in the next semester before I graduate. Yeah.
So Justin, how about at the graduate level?
I think at the graduate level, not as much. I think part of that is, graduate courses are usually dependent on the faculty and what their interests are and trying to find alignment there. And at least within the Yale political science department, there's not really any faculty member who solely focuses on the founding or American political thought. Bruce Ackerman is kind of a famous political scientist, theorist. He's, I think, mostly in the law school now. He used to teach more like American political thought classes. This is not to denigrate him. I think he looked at it from a much more critical lens than maybe whether you should or you could or what have you. But I think today there really isn't that opportunity. I'll say about my 3 semesters so far, I have not really touched on American political thought from early American political thought.
I was actually going to ask you a follow-up question on that because your focus is on American history, and American politics, rather. Are there other faculty for you that you can bounce ideas off of, other grad students that you can talk to who aren't just, happy to listen and respond based on their own knowledge? Of the people who have specialties in that area that you can talk to?
I would say generally, I don't know, again, if there's somebody who exactly focuses on early America per se, there's nobody writing a book on Hamilton or Jefferson or anything like that. But I do think most, like, what is a PhD? Like, why am I doing this, right? It's you're with a group of people who are so passionate about something that they're really interested in that they want to spend their entire lives in a university teaching that. And so even if maybe my interests aren't completely early American history, their interests aren't early American history, you're still going to talk about history. You're going to talk about politics, the intersection of both. So I found that most people are open to discussions, open to kind of learning more about particular time periods, particular individuals, dynamics, even if maybe they're not then going to go out and write a paper or a book or teach a class on it or something like that.
I think it'll be like interesting to see like a maybe founding fathers course or a early American politics course. And for freshers to take, I think it's hard to be like political science major and like continue to study like politics and continue to study like the research around politics without having like a strong foundation on like the founding fathers.
So do you guys think it's important to know more about the founders, study founding, like the founding ideology?
I mean, I think so. Right? We're still living with the same Constitution that Hamilton helped write. We're still living with the interpretations in the Federalist Papers, right? About what is the executive branch, what is the legislative branch, what do political parties and factions, how do they work? And I think we often either have a desire to, or not a desire, I should say, an expectation that, oh, well, those ideas are old. We've kind of grown away from them, or obviously people who are much more antagonistic towards the founding, trying to focus on the faults. But I think those ideas, right, Hamilton's values, the passions that Mickey talked about, they're still a foundation of America. And I think to better understand the present, you have to understand the foundation. You still have to understand the past.
Do you guys worry Do you feel it's kind of an unpopular opinion to be, this is important to talk about? Like, we should know what George Washington thinks. We should know what Thomas Jefferson thinks. We should know what Alexander Hamilton thought and wrote. Is that something you think is totally accepted as a normal opinion, or is that something you feel like you're taking a little bit of a risk if you have to share it?
I mean, I'll say I think, like any politically charged debate, I think it depends on what spaces you're in, or it depends on who you're talking to. Again, I feel like if we're talking about like the general public, I think it's just more uninformed than malicious or anything like that. Because I think, to Mickey's point, right, maybe you don't have the courses, especially early in college or high school. Or you kind of I definitely glossed through the founding because you had to get to the Civil War, you had to get to Vietnam, you had to get to other more quote unquote important time periods or more relevant quote unquote relevant eras of history. I think there are, of course, there are the people who are like, oh, well, they're slave owners, they're this, they're that. Like, why should we give them value or importance? But I also do think that there are genuinely people at Yale and elsewhere who, even if, okay, I'm not going to buy into every aspect of Hamilton's thought, which I don't, or Jefferson's thought, which I don't, or, things like that, right? You don't have to be fully laudatory to see, hey, this was America's founding. This is how we got the country that we have today. And we are going to understand them, understand their time period, understand their philosophy, to then better understand the 200 plus years in between then and now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think probably like most people, I think we have the sense of like, oh, like we already know what the Founding Fathers is about. But then like when you ask deeper questions or is forced to think about it more critically, I don't think we come to realize that maybe we don't really actually know like what the Founding Fathers meant or what they stood for. Like if you ask me like before what I thought about the Founding Fathers or what their role was, I'll probably be like, yeah, I know like about the Founding Fathers. But now after looking back and watching the show of Hamilton, I'm like, wow, I don't really know much about the Founding Fathers. Yeah. So I think a lot of people are in that position.
I mean, if I could just give like a very quick example, right? Like probably, I think one of the reasons why maybe people don't want to talk about the founding or don't see the value of it is slavery, right? And obviously the existence of slavery, the fact that some of the Founding Fathers, maybe even most of them were slave owners at one time or another. The musical, I think, did very well. Well, no, Hamilton actually did have certain anti-slavery principles. He was working with, I think John Lawrence, I think was his name, right? Who was talking about, and I think I don't know if he actually succeeded, but, about arming recently enslaved African Americans in the South and using them to fight against the British. One thing that I think I appreciate about Hamilton, or even just I think studying this era in general, is you're not going to cover everything, right? You're not going to be able to learn every single detail. But if you get people to see the importance of the time period, of the people, of the dynamics, then they'll want to learn more. And they'll learn the good, they'll learn the bad, they'll learn everything in between. And you'll just, I think, get not just a more holistic, but a more accurate view of America and of American history.
And not just of like the Founding Fathers, but understanding the context that surrounded their time. Then I think that's like super important. I think like sometimes we just gloss over it or like maybe categorize it too generally. But I think understanding the Founding Fathers' actions and like their thoughts help us better understand the context of that time and the things that were at play.
So I want to go back to an idea that you guys raised and talked about in the beginning, because this is something that always hits me when I like listen to one of the songs from Hamilton or like, when I read the book or read anything about him. It's just, A, how young he was, and, B, how accomplished he was at such a young age. And right, you think about the Federalist Papers, and he wrote like 50 some odd of the, whatever, I think they're like 80, I can't remember the exact number.
It's like 55 of the 81 or something like that.
Right. And it just makes me feel like I wish I, one, had like the energy and like mental capacity he did. And two, I wish I aspire to be that passionate about anything in my life that I could dedicate that much time and energy. And I just wonder, like, you guys, you're, I guess, in a PhD program, undergrads, like, is there anything that you guys, are that passionate about, want to be that passionate about, that I want to do more, and these are the kind of things I want to work on?
As I head into my senior year, I think this is like a very fitting question. It's not just about like a post-grad job. I'm not just like looking for a post-grad job. I think, well, these days I've been asking a lot of myself, like, what is my purpose in life, and what are things that like I actually want to work on that I'm passionate about. And I think one of those things is definitely education. I think this has been something it's been more like crystallized over the past 2 years in working with kids one-on-one. So I think the public education is something that I feel really passionate about. And as someone who like grew up in the public education and seen the flaws of it, but also like the good of it in some ways, I think it is definitely a big topic that I think both sides of like the political spectrum like care deeply about. And so I think that's something I feel really deeply about and want to work passionately on over the next course years of my life.
I mean, I think for me, this PhD experience is what I'm passionate about, right? Coming, as an undergrad, right? Most of my friends who did history or political science, they're working on the Hill. They just got out of law school, or they're in law school. You're consulting. You're doing all these things. I'm the only one who's like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to dedicate the next 5 to 7 years of my life making much less money, back in the classroom, back in school, doing TAing and all that stuff, just for like this. I think love, passion for politics and for history, and then to Mickey's point, right? To then teach that to the next generation. I want to be a college professor. I want to be maybe not in the room where it happened, but in a room where the next generation will learn about these ideas, whether about the founding or other aspects of American political history.
You'll be a great professor.
I hope so. We'll see.
Well, thanks so much for joining me, Justin, Mickey. Thanks for coming on Pod and Man at Yale.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us.
I'd now like to move on to my interview with noted historian Richard Brookhiser on how America views the founders today. I'd like to welcome Richard Brookhiser to Pod and Man at Yale. Richard Brookhiser is an American journalist, biographer, and historian. He's senior editor at National Review. He's most widely known for a series of biographies of America's founders, including Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, and George Washington. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I should also say I was class of 77, and I'm a sometime chairman of the Party of the Right.
Right, I forgot. Yeah, Yale alum. It's an extra honor to have you for that too. I'd say I have actually one of your books sitting on my shelf back in my childhood home, and I always want to bring it with me, but my parents probably want it there, so I left it there. So it's an honor to talk to you. And it's also an honor because there are few who have really studied the founders, as deeply as you have. So I'll start with a broad question about the founders. Where do they sit in the American culture at this point in our history? Do you get a sense are America's founders are mostly revered? Are they rejected? Are they ignored, or something else?
Well, they're there, whether they're noticed or not, because the experiment they began is still ongoing. And the institutions they set up are still with us. And obviously, they've changed. Provisions for change were part of the institutions. The Constitution has a provision for amendments, which has been used to considerable effect. But they're at the start. And the start is not that long ago as a lot of countries counted. I mean, compared to, let's even forget China and Egypt, compared to England and France, we're still pretty young. So the founders are with us, whether we know it or not. And I think we do know it. And I think mostly the feeling towards them is positive. We can spend a lot of time, and I'm sure we'll spend a little time, nitpicking with left-wing historians or critical historians of whatever stripe. But ordinary Americans, I think, respect these men. They may not know a lot about them, but they know a few key events. Some images are in the nation's mind's eye. People walk through the rotunda of the Capitol and they see paintings of the Revolution. They go to Mount Rushmore, and there are two founders' heads on that mountain. I think you still see presidential placemats in restaurants, and they start off with the founding presidents, and then I just saw for the second time a production of Hamilton, an American musical, which it conquered the world when it premiered, and who would have thought? But it won 11 Tonys, and that's wall-to-wall founders. So they're still with us.
So I definitely want to come back to your experience at Hamilton a little bit later, but there's so much in there, and I want to ask you a couple follow-up questions, because I think there is a sense that there is kind of like a cadre. Maybe it's just on college campuses, maybe it's in like the intellectual radical left, of viewing the founders as like the quote unquote old white man or old white racist for the more extreme version. So your sense is that that's not really a prevalent view, that it's just a small minority? Does it exist at all? Is it something to be concerned about? Is it something you worry about?
Look, they were white, and many of them were slave owners. Most of them, or certainly many of them, were conflicted about that, thought that this would probably end in time, hoped that it would end in time. They didn't have, most of them didn't have very practical plans about it. Some of them freed their own slaves. Washington, maybe most famously, freed his slaves in his will. Franklin had owned slaves as a younger middle-aged man, and he freed them, and then he joined an abolition society in Philadelphia at the end of his life. Others never were tainted by the institution, such as John Adams. So there's reality there that has to be faced and acknowledged. But the principles under which slavery was finally ended in this country were principles announced by the founders. Garrison's Liberator used to run the Declaration of Independence in every issue. And it was that rhetoric that Lincoln used to win the presidency, and then ultimately to turn the Civil War from a war just for the Union to a war also to extinguish slavery. So the founders gave the weapons. The founders gave the surgical tools against the diseases many of which they still suffered from.
So I want to jump to Hamilton because you just joined a few Buckley Fellows in New York to see it. I don't know if it was your first time seeing it. I imagine it wasn't, but what do you think of the show?
Well, I saw it when it was at the Public Theater before it went to Broadway. So I saw it very early and with the original cast, including Lin-Manuel Miranda. I was amazed at the level of detail they were able to get in. An American musical about the founding that has Samuel Seabury as a character, New York Anglican loyalist. I mean, he's got a little part, but the fact that he's there at all, they're digging pretty deep. And look, they took shortcuts. Lafayette is shown as being here 2 years before he got here. Jefferson and Madison confront Hamilton with his illicit love affair. They didn't do it personally. It was James Monroe, who was their sort of junior ally, who did it. So there are things like that. But broadly, the show is accurate. It's a very Federalist Party in the second act. And that reflects a pattern in American life and history that Hamilton and Jefferson never leave the pantheon. But one will be up and the other will be down, and they alternate. Hamilton had a very good early 20th century. That's when he got on the $10 bill. And then FDR began like 50 years of Jefferson. He put him on the nickel and he put him on the tidal basin. Mm-hmm. And why did he do that? Well, he wanted a Southerner. He wanted a Democrat. He wanted rhetoric that could be used against fascism. And what better is there than in the Declaration? And he also wanted someone whose polemics against Hamilton's wealthy, rich friends could be used against FDR's enemies, during the New Deal. So Jefferson checked all the boxes. And then as the civil rights movement matured, and then people also not only took an interest in the history of slavery, but also in Sally Hemings, then Jefferson began to sink a bit. And Hamilton was one of the founders of the New York Manumission Society. So not only is Jefferson looking a little bad, but Hamilton's looking a little good. So that began to change the balance. But look, and I'm pretty Federalist myself, but I have to say the two things I think Jefferson most believed were that men have rights and that the people are most often right. And those two ideas do not necessarily follow from each other. You could believe in rights and think that, well, democracy is a very unreliable way to protect rights. Or you could be a populist and think, well, the hell with rights. But Jefferson believed in both of those things. And if he's wrong, America's wrong, because those are really baked into what the United States is and how it works and what it means and what it offers to the world.
It's interesting you bring up those 2 points, because I think about when I was growing up in high school and really getting into the political world, and the idea of how you viewed human nature, I guess, and whether you could trust human beings to make decisions, was then and still is a frame for how people saw their politics. Then I thought, if you didn't trust people, you were a capitalist, made you conservative. But I've definitely come around on that, and I'm a very optimistic view of people. And I'm still conservative, and I see people don't trust people who are Democrats and trust people who are liberal. And I just kind of wonder that perspective, right? That you said that Jefferson believed men had rights and generally felt people were right on the whole, with caveats. Was that a perspective that was shared by the founders, or was that a subject of debate between them?
Well, Jefferson is certainly, in theory, on the rosier side. Now, sometimes it came back to bite him. I mean, his policy in his second term for staying out of this European World War was an embargo. The two superpowers, Britain and France, were basically ordering us as a neutral nation not to trade with each one's enemy, and if we did, they'd seize our ships. And this was a serious thing. So Jefferson did not want to go to war. And he thought the measure before that would be to prevent us from trading with either of these countries. And then they would suffer from the lack of our wheat and whatever, and then they'd change their ways. Well, they did. They may have suffered, but they didn't change their ways. And it was very bad for America. And it became hugely unpopular, and Jefferson got migraines. And, at the end of his term, he said, he just threw up his hands. He said, I'm going to be a spectator. I'm just not going to do anything for the remainder of my term, last few months. So, and that was very distressing to him, because he hoped that he would benefit, his popularity would benefit from his agreement with the people who would do the right thing, i.e. support him. So, he got bitten by that. Hamilton is an example of someone with I think, a darker view of the world because of his own life experiences. His father walks off, his mother dies when he's young, so he's left, in effect, as an orphan. He has to make his way both in St. Croix and then finally when he's sent to North America. So there's a kind of, always in the back of Hamilton, there's a kind of a fear or a fragility that he's always trying to counteract with his plans and his energy and his take chargeness. That's the way he's going to keep it all at bay. It's interesting, he writes a letter to Lafayette in the earliest days of the French Revolution. And, he's a good friend of Lafayette. They were comrades in the war. America, the initial American view is, France is good. So therefore, our revolution was good. Therefore, their revolution has to be good, right? But Hamilton writes Lafayette a letter and he says, look, here's some problems. All the people who want change now, they agree they want change. They may not agree on what kind of change. Your nobility is pretty reactionary. They're going to dig in their heels against any sort of change. French people are, ardent and passionate, and they may be a little hard to rein in once they get going. And you've got a lot of theorists with no practical experience of government because it was an absolutist state. I mean, how could anyone get the experience? So he ticks off all these problems, which, all turn out to be really serious problems. And they come crashing in on Lafayette's head 3 years into the revolution. And he he feels he has to leave the country, and then he's captured by France's enemies, and that's his story. But so Hamilton, saw potential problems with the French Revolution, then saw that they'd become actual problems, and was very much opposed to it. And this was one of the first political divides in this country. Do we like the French Revolution or don't we? Jefferson doesn't bail on it until the rise of Napoleon.
Oh, interesting. So he sticks with the revolution until basically the revolution ends in a dictatorship.
In a military dictator, which is like the worst type of person Jefferson can imagine, and Napoleon is that. So
did it give him some second thoughts about the revolution from the beginning, or he at that point thought it wasn't coming back?
Well, no, I don't think he ever went back and decided, gee, I was wrong about all this. He just thought, this Corsican adventurer, this evil Corsican adventurer took over, and what a shame that was.
So I guess what are you've done? You've looked into a lot of the founders. You clearly know a lot about the specific details of their lives, their interplay. Is there a founder you think doesn't get as much notice, who should be talked about a little more? People you wish people knew a little bit about, a little more.
Well, look, I love Gouverneur Morris. I just love to be in the man's company. And he did draft the Constitution. And the dean of Georgetown Law School, he just wrote a very interesting paper about how Morris really tweaked it. My summary of his argument was that Morris was like a pitching machine, sending slow ones straight down the strike zone for Team Federalists to knock out of the park, Washington, Hamilton, and Chief Justice Marshall. So that's an interesting argument, but he's just a delightful man, wrote a great diary. He's in France as a businessman, then as our minister to France during the French Revolution, from the meeting of the Three Estates to finally after the fall of Robespierre. He's there during that whole thing, and his account of what's going on is really, it's like Alan First, his novels about World War II, only at a higher social level. Fascinating stuff. Sam Adams is tough to write about. He has no papers. He was just slovenly and didn't keep good records. So there we are with him. But he's very important in getting the revolution going, in planning it, in plotting it, in wanting it to happen. And then John Jay, there was something maybe recessive about him. He was first Chief Justice, important diplomat, governor of New York. But then he steps back from politics for really like the last 30 years of his life. And so we've kind of lost sight of him. I mean, he's one of our three Federalist Papers authors. And Akhil Amar at Yale Law School says that the executive summary of the Federalist Papers, like the first 9 that got printed as a pamphlet and distributed even more widely than the whole thing, well, 5 of those are by Jay, and he makes, very plain, potent arguments as to why the country should be united. I mean, one of his things is he points to the centuries of conflict between England and Scotland, and how France especially took advantage of that. Well, we don't want to have that here in North America, says John Jay. And people, they got that. That was just an aspect of recent history that they were very familiar with, and Jay really hammered it. But then Jay gets sick. He gets rheumatoid arthritis, and then he's hit in the head with a rock during a riot in New York City. So he's out of commission for the whole thing. So 85 Federalist Papers, and he's written only, 5. So maybe we should pay some more attention to him. But I think we do a pretty good job of knowing who the main people were. And we also, and then it is a true point that we also have to realize that they're not just talking only to each other or in some kind of rarefied common room. They are presenting their ideas to the American public. and the American public is reading them, reacting to them, debating them. The Constitutional Convention was secret. No, no minutes published. The delegates were not supposed to talk about what they were doing. But then when they finished it, there was a year of debate, a nationwide year of debate, and people, they really went at it. We read the Federalist Papers, but that was only one of the polemics that were churned out pro and con. So we can never ignore the people. We can never ignore the public in these events.
So speaking of the public, I'm curious if we drill down to a specific subsection, our college campuses, Buckley Institute's focused on college campus. And I'm wondering, how do you think the founders are treated on college campuses among the student body and among the professors?
Well, I'm not on campuses a lot. I mean, I give talks occasionally here and there, and I do know some professors. I mean, my sense of it was that the teaching of this period of American history survived a lot of the craziness that hit the humanities much longer than anything else. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I'm class of 77. I was an English major. Even when I was there, the last new critics were retiring. And this wave of theory was coming in. I mean, just crazy theory, a lot of it French, some of it self-generated. Harold Bloom, he turned himself into Samuel Johnson. But when I was an undergraduate, he was just this crazy gnostic with these incomprehensible readings of the Romantic poets. The teaching of the founding period escaped that, and it was just an artifact of, you had certain important academics like Douglas Adair and Bernard Bailyn and Edmund Morgan, and then their students who got PhDs and became professors, and that lasted for a long time. And what they did, as opposed to their immediate predecessors, people like Charles Beard, they wanted to study the founders by taking their ideas seriously. They said these were people who had ideas about how the country should be run, whether it should be a country, and then when it was, how it should be run. So let's try and figure out what those ideas were and how Americans reacted to them. So they were taking ideas seriously. Well, then they've retired, they've died, they've retired. One man told me that when he stepped down, he did not expect to be replaced by another person teaching the kind of thing he taught. He said, "I will be replaced by a specialist in looms."
Okay.
Just looms, how fabric is made, and who weavers were, and what was the culture of weaving, and how it was bought and sold. And, that's interesting. But you also don't want to lose sight of the American crisis, right, or the Declaration or the Federalist Papers. So he was presenting that as a loss. Mm-hmm. But look, I don't think it's gone away entirely either. I still get asked to speak here and there, so that suggests that there's an interest in it. And my other thought is that good stories just beat bad ones. They beat dull ones and they beat stupid ones. And a smart story of the American Revolution and of the construction of the government that followed is a dramatic story. It's an interesting story. It's an intelligent story. I mean, there's a lot of intelligence involved by the actors. And you have to bring some intelligence to bear to understand everything that was going on. And it's a story that's not that long ago and that still affects us today. How are you going to beat that?
Well put. So I want to, before we wrap up, I want to ask you about Buckley. It's a centennial year. You wrote a book about Buckley. Your connection to Buckley through National Review, I think, goes back to when you were a teenager. I saw online. It was continued ever since. You're still connected. You still write for National Review. So, taking kind of a broad, it's one question perspective, what do you think is Buckley's lasting legacy on the country? Like, especially in the context of our conversation about founders, is he kind of like a founder in a sense of maybe the modern conservative movement or like a modern politics or modern way of debate, modern political communication?
Well, he was the catalyst of the post-war conservative movement. My friend Larry Perlman calls him the impresario of it. Bill Rusher, my dear friend who was publisher of National Review, he said Buckley kept all the bears in their cages doing their tricks, referring to the early intellectuals of the post-war conservative movement. He also was an important figure he was an important public intellectual. That's a term that gets used a lot, and unfortunately, in a way that makes your eyes roll or makes you fall asleep. But you never fell asleep with Bill. I mean, he was perfect for the kind of television show that he did. This was TV with 3 networks plus public television. No bells and whistles, no crawls at the bottom of the screen. No YouTube clips, and nothing like that. But for a very simple TV format, he was great because you couldn't not watch him. You couldn't not listen to him. Part of that was mannerisms, part of that was his accent, but it was also what he was saying. He had a gift for saying intelligent things, amusing things in ways that would grab people, that people would pay attention to. He would also listen to people who disagreed with him. I remember I was on some panel in New York at the New School, and this older man came up to me and said, "Are you still in touch with Bill Buckley, who'd retired by then?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, will you thank him from me? I'm a radical, but he was the only place where you got to see radicals talking at length, because he'd bring them on to firing line and he'd debate them. In other venues they might mention them or cover them or something, but Bill would bring them on and go rounds with them. And this older man, he thought that was a unique thing. So Bill did do that. It was a way of public talking that was not shouting, that was not yelling. Now, we all want to shout and yell now, so maybe what he did is no longer being done so much. And also the conservative movement that he created is gone. It's been destroyed. Donald Trump is the new focus of everything. And certainly that'll be as long as he's president. Will it outlast him? We'll see. But, we'll see how that marches on. But certainly for now, Buckleyism, Reaganism, Goldwaterism, they're just gone. And it's Trumpism. The Oval Office looked like a mobster's toilet and, do all the other things that Trump does, some of which, I'm glad they were done. All credit to him. Others pretty horrible. But there we are. It's a different world.
Well, appreciate it. Thanks for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale. And thank you for all your research, all your work, and all you've done in the past.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me.
That's another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale. Subscribe if you haven't already. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale, in that order.